during this period of health concern. The consecrated wine, blood of Christ, has already been suspended until further notice. Mass celebrants and extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion are to ensure their hands are thoroughly cleansed. Practice good hygiene, frequently washing your hands with soap or with a purifying sanitizing gel. Do not touch eyes, nose, or mouth with hands before washing. Please cover your mouth with a handkerchief, tissue paper, or your elbow when coughing or sneezing during Mass or service or anywhere in public. Also at home. Please don't be offended if we do not shake hands coming into church or leaving, or don't greet each other in our usual manners. While taking the above precautions, we call upon our faith community to remain calm, to trust official announcements, and be responsible. We thank you for participating in these uncommon precautions. If I could just add one thing, as I was invited to participate in an infectious disease seminar this past week at the hospital, where I've kind of been working as a student chaplain. One of the things that with many infectious diseases is that they're airborne, also surface-borne, and that they have a life of some type. And just sharing this very simple information with you, why these measures are important for us today. We're kind of in a period of containment because of the coronavirus, and we're not sure how it spreads and how it's airborne, if it's droplet airborne, and also through touch. And so these measures are to help us in trying to kind of contain its spread so that it can be at least looked at so that somehow a remedy may be found. Secondly, and I think while this may cause us to concern about how we're going to practice or express our faith tradition, I would just say to you, it's important to still be people of faith and to recognize the goodness and love of God that we want to express for one another. But these simple measures just help us here and also at home, but also in public places, just to help more or less use this time with not only the coronavirus, but any other type of airborne virus or the flu to contain it. Thank you very much. So let me just share a few words. During my homily, one of the things that just as we begin Lent and it's 40 days, which starts usually, I always say it starts on the first Sunday of Lent. The way I look at it, it tries to give us a certain kind of direction. And one of the directions that I offer to people for reflection, that it's used in some ways to prepare us for Easter and to recognize, I think, the renewal of life we need. You and I are, as baptized Christians, we share an identity in Jesus, and what we profess, not only in faith and words, but also in actions, and who we are as people, is that the living God and the Spirit of Jesus works through us. I know we may not see that every day within us, but that's kind of what we do. And you know, as we, as human beings, go through life, some of that gets tarnished. We forget about these things. And often Lent, through its ascetical practices of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, of reflection, of participating in various activities, helps us to reflect, to respond to the work of God in us. That hopefully during this period of time, we can see something new, or at least appreciate a grace. That as we come to Easter, and further from that moment, we recognize and approach some sense of joy that God is working through us again. It's kind of like reunion and renewal that we all need. Human beings need that. Everyone goes through periods of preparation. That's one thing we need. So that's kind of my intro. And here's kind of where I'd like to take you on a trip, if you will, to help us understand maybe some of its nuances. You know, there are things we see, and there are things we don't see. I could go off and talk about airborne viruses that we don't see and how that affects our lives, but that's not my point. But there are things we see and there are things we don't see. We use our perceptions to gain and work in the world and to live in the world. We can see each other, we can recognize each other, many of us can hear and have different ways that we approach the world. And so we see each other. You can see me, I can see you, and if we know each other, we can acknowledge each other in some wonderful way. But there's things we don't see. We don't see our life stories. We don't see who we are. We don't know where we've been. We don't know where we've come from. We only see surface level things. And so we're limited. In some ways, we don't see all the things we want to see. Human life and the the way I would approach this with you, and also the spiritual life. That place of faith and religion and our spirits that come together that we try to acknowledge and live in our lives works on the same principle. There are things we see. We can recognize goodness. We can appreciate it. We can see that in one another. We can see maybe the grace of God working in us as well. And then there's things we don't see. There's a hiddenness within our lives. We don't see many times the struggles of what can be there. We don't always know the kind of hurts or longings or the joys and graces that we receive. There's a hiddenness. And then sometimes that hiddenness is very well hidden. We don't know what's going on within us and how that is reflected to us, or at least it guides us. And I share this with you as kind of an image or an illustration to say that in this holy time, but also as part of our lives, there are things that are kind of secluded and removed from us. We are limited in what we see and know and can acknowledge about God working in us. I offer this to you because in some ways it addresses something very particular for us as Christians. Today, as we begin Lent, it reminds us of recognizing sin and its kind of power and effects in our lives. When I say sin, I'm not always talking about the little things that we do to aggravate each other. Okay? Because everyone thinks that sin is the little things that I got upset at my husband, someone cut me off, I said a bad word, go on. Those are little things, those are sins. People might call those venial sins, whatever category we want to put them in is fine. Those are little things that might have something to do with the bigger thing. But the real part of sin that we need to really acknowledge is the alienation, the separations and divisions that it causes within the human person and in the human community and in our relationships. When we talk about sin, we talk about that aggravation and that power and content that breaks things apart, that shatters things, that fractures things. And oftentimes it leaves you and I as human beings wounded, kind of hurting. And now some wounds, as you know, we can see. We can see some wounds. There's a lot of wounds we can't see. Humanity has this uniqueness that sometimes we have these psychic wounds that we kind of live with in life that may have happened to us, have been exposed to, we've encountered or more or less participated in with someone else that hurts us. And in some ways, that's kind of one of the things that we grapple with as human beings and people of faith is how do we come to a greater sense of healing and understanding that God is working through us to come to healing. And why I share this with you, our first reading talks about sin, kind of in its mythic story of creation, but also its power and effect. And one line that I'd like to lead you to think about is this idea that Adam and Eve, after they recognized they ate, they felt shame. They felt shame. And they covered themselves. They recognized that they were naked. Not so much naked just in the flesh, but in what it tries to allude to in our humanity and to our own personhood, if you will, is that there's something of their innocence that was lost they see. And they recognize it. Shame. What is shame? Oftentimes when you think about what it is, and there's different manifestations of it. Well, when we talk about shame, it's kind of a psychic, conscious energy that we turn toward ourselves and we withdraw. It's an effect that's something we do when something has happened to us, usually because of a wound personally or kind of happened to us that we turn away. And usually when we turn away inside. And that's where we feel hurt and brokenness. Shame. There's a lot of different shame out there. We can feel shame for something we've done, and there's surface level forms of manifestations, but there's kind of the deeper ones that sometimes we're asked as human beings and people of faith to seek out in God's goodness to be healed and find that compassion. There are different forms of alienation that affect us that we feel those wounds. Sexism, racism, I could go down the list. You could choose your favorite one. There's many ways human beings have been created over the generations to create a world that has been broken, that affects human beings to discard and degrade one another. We're very good at that, unfortunately. And in the same way, while we may continue to do that, something that speaks to us that when we've been shamed or hurt, we turn away. There's something that breaks within us. And the power of what we're trying to ask to redo for ourselves is to be healed from that. Think about this. And I know this might get a little testy here, but think about all the hurt and shame many of us as people feel of people of faith. And what has happened to our church with all the scandals. I mean, I'm a priest and I feel ashamed because of the stories that we hear about us. That has an effect upon our lives and our behavior and how we try to live as human beings and to approach God and God's goodness. People turn away because of what has happened to us. That's shame. Think about the world that we live in and is being created and formed by us, by the public, kind of shaming and ridicule that we hear constantly in various forms, politically and otherwise, that constantly remind us how broken and messed up we are, and the shame that we turn away and we feel hurt. That's shameful, those actions. And we've kind of normalized them for ourselves. And where do we find the help and support? And I illustrate this with you because that's how powerful it is. St. Paul comes to us with these wonderful words, but also this wonderful grace to remind us. Just because as through one person, humanity, Adam and Eve, he kind of uses that image, brought sin and the effects of death, hurt, and separation. How much more? Because of one person who through his obedience and righteousness has come back to reunite humanity to all its goodness. That's the gift. The graciousness of God that's more powerful than sin, that offers humanity more and more opportunities to find healing in the midst of that brokenness and shame that many times we carry. And I think that's what the point I think that Paul is trying to offer us. He's trying to say because of the one person, and he uses this argument, but it's more so recognizing that grace and righteousness leads us upon that pathway, that we don't have to live in that way, because it offers us the gift of freedom within our spirit to live in a different way. That's what it really means. That we're not any more limited in our minds or our hearts or our spirits, but that we turn toward God, the reversal of turning towards ourselves. We turn toward God and see something that really heals a part of our humanity. To reunite, come home, be who we are meant to be. Be the church we're meant to be. Be the nation or community we're meant to be. That's where God calls us to. And Lent is that time, maybe personally or otherwise, we're invited to that journey. And I think one suggestion that I have is kind of reflecting on how we try to live our lives and recognize what we worship here. You know, this gathering is one that invites us to be inspired, to know that God is present and that our dependence maybe rests upon on God's goodness. You know, I'm almost 55 years old. I think I know everything sometimes. And I have to be honest with you, I don't. And I realize that in the midst of my humanity and how I work and try to relate to the world, I have to depend on God's goodness, because I haven't figured it out. That's the temptation. We got it all figured out. We don't need anyone else. And it blinds us to see what is at work. A book that I would offer for you to read maybe during Lent, it's kind of an older book, but it still has some relevance to who we are as people of faith. It's called The Holy Longing by Ronald Rolheiser. And what it is a wonderful display of what's involved in our spirits, what's involved in our human walking with one another, what is involved in us coming to realize the living God in our midst, that we too, as people of faith, may turn toward God and God's goodness.